Welcome back to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Eugene Puryear, here with Sean Blackman. And as always, we're your guide to connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And we are talking today about I would say, a very interesting political situation and developments there in Ethiopia. Very happy to be joined for this conversation by the journalist Mohammed Ademo. Mohammed, thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure to be on.
No, well, the pleasure is all ours.
Yeah. Now, Mohammed, late last week, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Hailemariam Desalegn, excuse my pronunciation, he stepped down, and shortly thereafter, a state of emergency was called in Ethiopia that reportedly is to last for 6 months. Could you sort of begin by breaking down the broader context around these events and what's been going on in the country that led to this point?
Ethiopia has been ruled by one authoritarian party since 1991. So for the last 27 years, there has been a pent-up anger, people calling for more democratic rights, calling for free and fair elections, and this party has won elections by as much as 100% in the last election in 2015, and it has faced relentless protest during its entire quarter of a century reign. But in the past 4 years, these protests have really become more vigorous and more organized. And as you have reported, during the crackdown over the past 2 years alone, more than 1,000 people were killed, hundreds of thousands of people were incarcerated, some of them held in what some people characterize as concentration camps. There is a widespread abuse and torture reported by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and others. So I think all of this culminated in October of 2016 in the declaration of the first state of emergency. That lasted for 10 months. And when the state of emergency was basically, when it ended in August of 2017, literally after a couple of days, the protesters returned to the streets. So at that point, the government understood that business as usual is not going to work, and they needed to make a change in direction. And as part of that, the ruling party, the executive team, had a meeting in December. And one of the things that came out of that meeting was a decision to free some of the political prisoners who have been really the battle cry of the protesters, if you will. And over the past month, some 6,000 political prisoners have been released. But even with that, the protests continue because the calls for political reforms, legal reforms, have never been addressed. There's a young population that is unemployed, and they want a seat at the table. They want their voices to be heard. Ethiopia is a repressive state with no free media. These young people need an outlet to air their grievances. Those outlets are essentially closed. So I think when the protests returned last week, the authorities sort of made a knee-jerk reaction, as they have always done over the past 27 years, and came back with same repressive measures to sort of contain the streets.
I see. So what we're really seeing is a continuation of protests that's been happening for some time and now has been sharpened because of conditions on the ground in Ethiopia.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, one thing I'm curious your thoughts about, what do you think this state of emergency is going to mean for the citizenry of Ethiopia? Like, will this serve as a crackdown on the public, or how do you see this playing out, particularly given that this, as you pointed out, this will be the second state of emergency in 2 years?
It is very hard to say because the authorities are giving mixed signals. On the one hand, they're releasing prisoners, they're calling for a national dialogue, but at the same time, they are putting a state of emergency in place, which really puts a lot of restrictions on freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and denying people the same rights that they pledged to provide. So it is all very confusing. But what it means for the people of Ethiopia is people see the light at the end of the tunnel. They've suffered for so long. They fought so hard. So many people died. I think they see a victory on the horizon, and people are not going to back down. So in that context, it will be interesting to see in the coming months when protests continue, if the security forces are going to use the same excessive force that has characterized really the tenor of this government. I think that would be interesting thing to watch, whether or not they will restrain themselves and use a less lethal crowd control mechanisms. That's one thing to watch for. The other important thing to watch for is the Prime Minister, as you noted in your opening brief, stepped down, and now there's a vacancy in that position. So who would they put forward as the successor for the Prime Minister Hailemariam Desalegn is going to be very important, because these protests concentrate mostly in the Oromia region. Oromia is the largest of 9 linguistic-based states. And the Oromo, the largest group in Ethiopia, have been complaining about political marginalization for years. A lot of people say this is the time for an Oromo Prime Minister. So that's the first signal they could send by putting an Oromo Prime Minister forward. But it has to also be someone capable, has leadership qualities, someone who can unite the party. The party itself is deeply fractured. And more importantly, I think someone who can forge a broad-based national consensus and bring the country together around a democratic vision that addresses some of the protesters' grievances, but also charts a future for the young people where they can see themselves and they can see a future for them in this country.
Right. Well, you touched upon this a little bit in your statements just a moment ago, Mohammed. But I was wondering if you could speak a little more about the role that ethnic politics play in this issue. And I know that this is something that tends to rear its head in Ethiopia, and how this relates to what's happening with the vacant prime minister position.
Yeah, absolutely. I think ethnicity is the sort of main organizing principle in Ethiopia. It has been that way for a very long time. But in 1991, when this government came to power, it was, a group of liberation movements, Marxist-Leninist liberation fronts, who came together and overthrew an authoritarian communist dictator. And at that point, the country was sort of like a unitary state in which one culture, one language was imposed on the majority group. And as you can imagine, Ethiopia is one of the most diverse nations on earth, with 80-plus ethnic groups, linguistic groups. So I think ethnic federalism or multinational federalism, I think that's the more appropriate language to use, was used essentially as a compromise. So let's stay together, give everyone a voice, give everyone a local leadership. So basically what you have in the United States, the state of Virginia, Maryland have their own governors, and they are sovereign in a certain sense. The federal government has some powers, but the states also are empowered, and they have their own elections for local leaders. That sort of arrangement, but based on linguistic boundaries. So the country was divided into 9 linguistic-based states, and by linguistic, of course, behind the language is the identity of the ethnic groups who live in those states. But what happened, though, was even though the Constitution promised decentralization, giving states, as I alluded to, more power, more autonomy, and control over regional affairs to use their local language for administrative matters and that sort of thing, the decentralization just never trickled down. Power remained concentrated at the top in Addis Ababa, the capital. And that was really one of the sort of grievances that people had for many years, because they felt that a minority group, in this case the ethnic Tigrayans, who make up about 6% of the population, really controlled the commanding heights of the economy. They controlled the intelligence, they controlled the military, and until recently they controlled the foreign ministry, the office of the prime minister. So a minority ethnic group basically creating a hegemonic sort of existence over the rest of the country. This led to widespread resentment, and it fuels the discontent about political marginalization.
Right. Now, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mohammed, but what you're describing sounds like basically a pro-democracy movement that we're seeing in the streets that's calling, for these freedoms as well as an address of those concrete conditions. And you mentioned earlier about the release of political prisoners. So all these things that we see like that, along with the prime minister stepping down, it definitely feels like the leadership in Ethiopia is trying to, release some of the steam or release some of the pressure off of what's happening there politically. So, I mean, what sort of, and again, we're dealing with an absent prime minister. So, I mean, what sort of concrete things do you think will have to be put in place that will actually sort of allay sort of the intensity of these protests?
I think you are absolutely right. The movement have been largely peaceful, democratic, organized around nonviolence, civil disobedience. In that sense, especially in the face of the massive crackdown from the security services, it has been unprecedented in its restraint on the streets. And the authorities are, yes, they're given some ground, but their hands have been forced. And they really have no option. They cannot continue to do the same thing. They are still continuing to do the same thing with the state of emergency, but in the long term, I'm hopeful it's not sustainable. The people are not going to accept it. As far as what immediate things they can do, I think they have to elect someone who's willing to sit down with the opposition, which has a large support base, and negotiate with them about a transition, an all-inclusive transition, where the political environment can be a more level playing field. Right now, the government controls the media. You have to ask permission to hold rallies and that sort of thing for the opposition. They have to lift those restrictions and allow opposition to organize openly and tell the Ethiopian people what their vision is for the future. Beyond that, as far as reform, Ethiopia has used a number of repressive legislations. The first, one of the more notorious one, is the anti-terrorism legislation, which came, on the heels of the U.S. war on terrorism, and essentially criminalizes all forms of dissent. And you oppose the government, you are a critical of government, and everything that I'm saying to you on this broadcast could get me charged with terrorism in Ethiopia. So they need to repeal that law or amend it at least to make it more democratic. That's the first step they can take. The other laws are the mass media law, which basically, again, has been used to put journalists in jail, to shut down independent media and newspapers, and the NGO law, which basically crippled civil society organizations and denied human rights groups access to Ethiopia and the local human rights groups the freedom to conduct investigations into these egregious abuses and the continued impunity of security forces. I think those steps can really begin to set a tone for the country, and the people can start to trust this government, because the government really faces legitimacy crisis and a trust deficit at the moment.
Right. And I'm curious, what has the response been from other countries in that region? I mean, have the governments of the nations surrounding Ethiopia had anything to say or offered any words at all or anything in the advent of everything that's happening in Ethiopia?
I think you have to look at the profile of those countries. So Ethiopia is surrounded by Somalia. Mm-hmm. There's been a lawless state since 1990s, and Ethiopia continues to meddle in Somali affairs. So the Somalis are not in any position to say anything really critical of the Ethiopian government, because the Ethiopian soldiers are deployed as part of UN and African Union peacekeeping mission there. And then you have South Sudan, which is another country that is reeling from the civil war and years of unrest. You have Kenya in the south, which remains unstable. And we are in a situation now that there are two people who are claiming to be the legitimate presidents of that country. You have the likes of Rwanda with Paul Kagame, another strong African figurehead, and Yoweri Museveni in Uganda. So the Horn of Africa generally, of course, I forgot to mention our northern neighbor in Eritrea, where the leader refuses to hold elections and thinks that elections are a waste of time, and he's been in power since 1991. So it is surrounded by bad actors to begin with, and there's a reason why it is called the troubled corner of Africa. That is the Horn of Africa. So there are no governments in the region that are democratic enough, that have the house in order, who could tell the Ethiopian government to clean it is mess. And of course, Ethiopia is very influential and is one of the strongest militaries in the region. So even they don't have the capacity to stand up to Ethiopia.
Yeah, and we got a couple minutes left, Mohammed, but I'm curious about the nature of the movement on the ground of those young people in terms of, is it more of a grassroots thing that you're seeing where it's just sort of people just sort of, coming out and demonstrating, or have we seen some, more organized efforts and sort of, discrete organized groups that have been putting forth a lot of the action that we've been seeing?
It's a grassroots-based horizontal movement. They are organizing around nonviolent resistance using such tactics as stay-home business strikes, boycotts, road closures in some places. And the protests have gotten a little bit out of hand, mostly because there are also provocateurs that are allegedly sent by the government. But overall, a group of young, unemployed people all across the country who are frustrated by the state of affairs. They want change. They want to be connected to the rest of the world. Ethiopia is one of the least connected countries on earth. That is by design. The government doesn't want to give the people more freedom. That includes better internet connection. Facebook and social media is routinely blocked. Websites from abroad are blocked. So you have a young people, assertive young people who want to relate and connect to the rest of the world. A government that refuses to let them have that freedom, use their creative energy, and channel their passion and their energy toward a more productive use.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mohammed, we're going to have to leave it there. I really appreciate you being willing to join the show here. We are going to have to move to a break on By Any Means Necessary here on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. We will, however, be back, so stay with us.